There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
This episode contains graphic depictions of violent crimes. Listener discretion is advised.
It was late 2011 when 54-year-old Kellie Martin had her accident. Along with her husband, Don Martin, Kellie was retrieving Christmas decorations from their attic in Garland, Texas, when she missed a step on a ladder. The fall resulted in a herniated disc in her back, an incredibly painful injury that she treated with physical therapy, muscle relaxers, and pain relief. Eventually, her doctor recommended surgery. An elementary school teacher, Kellie scheduled her surgery in the break of March 2012. The neurosurgeon, Dr. Duntcsh, explained that the procedure was simple and routine. It would only take 45 minutes with a quick recovery. When the day came, Kellie and Don had complete trust in Dr. Duntcsh. He was articulate and reassuring, the exact kind of doctor you'd want looking after you. But the 45 minutes came and went. Don sat in the waiting room, starting to wonder if something had gone terribly wrong. Eventually, Dr. Duntcsh came out. The surgery had been a success, he said, although Kellie was in a little bit of pain. Then, he went on to explain she might have to go up to the ICU or even stay overnight. Alarm bells started sounding for Don. Something wasn't right. Hours passed. Still, they were working on her. Don and Kellie's daughters arrived and waited with their father. They were confused, sick with worry. That's when the ICU physician and Dr. Duntcsh met with them. Kellie was dead. Dr. Duntcsh, they would later discover, had sliced an artery, and Kellie had bled to death. For the Martin family, they were living their absolute worst nightmare. What they didn't know was that of the 38 surgeries Dr. Duntcsh had completed in the last 2 years, 33 had gone wrong. Patients were left in chronic pain, others unable to walk or with permanent injuries. Patients and doctors demanded answers, and eventually they would get them.
All these people have something in common. They went to the same surgeon, a surgeon some are calling a sociopath, and they are telling stories of botched operations that left them with agonizing pain. Now, that surgeon has just been indicted for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. What was that deadly weapon? His surgical tools.
I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Marshall Louis, Wandery's Chief Content Officer who helped produce their hit podcast, Dr. Death, which outlines the malpractice of Christopher Duntsch, a Texas-based surgeon who in 2017 was sentenced to life in prison after killing 2 of his patients during surgery and maiming a further 31. I want to begin with the surgery that was performed by Dr. Christopher Duntsch on a patient named Mary Eford. What took place?
So Mary Eford went in for a relatively routine surgery. Duntsch actually performed surgery twice on Mary Eford, once at Baylor Plano, and the surgery went generally without incident, but a few months later, he told her that she needed another surgery. He was now practicing at a facility called Dallas Medical Center. And in that week at Dallas Medical Center, he performed 3 surgeries, the third of which was on Mary Eford. And it was the surgery that would ultimately lead to the trial where he faced criminal charges for what he had done.
And what did Dr. Duntsch specialize in? What kind of doctor was he?
Dr. Duntsch was a spinal surgeon. He got an MD and a PhD at the University of Tennessee. So you could call him a neurosurgeon or a spinal surgeon.
So Mary had her surgery, and she then needed to see another surgeon to have it fixed because what had happened had actually left her in such a state. That was Dr. Henderson. What did he find in Mary Eford's body?
Yeah, so Dr. Henderson was a surgeon with a lot of experience in Dallas. He got a phone call after Mary Eford had been partially paralyzed because of the surgery by Dr. Duntsch. Dr. Henderson was called in and he did what's called a revision surgery and go back in short order and try to see what happened and fix what happened. And he recorded a video of what he saw, and Duntsch had not done anything correctly, essentially.
And there were cases of screws being in the wrong place, weren't there?
Yes. So there was what's called a pedicle screw just sticking out of the bone with no clear purpose. So it looked as though Dr. Duntsch had screwed in a screw and then just left it there.
What sort of other mistakes was Dr. Duntsch making? When this started to unfold, what were they actually discovering about the surgeries he was performing?
What they discovered is kind of a complicated question because it depends on the surgery and who you ask. Some of the surgeries went okay, but took longer than they should have. Some were messy. But what happened was that over time, his surgeries became more and more erratic. Of course, he turned his best friend into a quadriplegic, which was his worst outcome up to that point, by severing a vertebral artery. And then after that, there were other events that happened that were even worse, where he left a surgical sponge inside an incision. There was an example of a surgery where he operated on the wrong vertebrae. So he did the right surgery, but in the wrong place. So it wasn't one thing that he kept doing over and over again. He had different problems with different surgeries, but it all added up to these questions of, does he even know what he's doing? Is he doing this on purpose? Is he doing it out of some sort of bloodlust? That's the $1 million question of this case.
And obviously every surgery comes with a risk. Were these particularly high risk, or would you describe these surgeries as relatively straightforward?
They were both. Many of the surgeries that had the worst outcomes were routine surgeries. I mean, of course, you're operating on the spine, so anything is a serious surgery, but these were surgeries that aren't supposed to take more than an hour tops, that any surgeon who has done thousands and thousands of surgeries in their life, which is usually where surgeons at this level are operating at. In this case, he was essentially botching very basic surgeries.
Going back to Dr. Duntsch at medical school, there were people who knew him then who have spoken out. How did they describe him at medical school?
At medical school, Duntsch, by most accounts, was really focused on research. He was interested in stem cells. He had been part of the founding of a company called Duntcsh that was going to be focused on research. He did not get nearly as much time in the operating room and in training as a surgeon would normally have gotten. So people at medical school said he was a fine student. There was nothing that stood out about his work. It was only really after that things came out and the fact that he had been put on a leave for substance abuse while he was at medical school.
Dr. Henderson ended up launching his own investigation into Duntsch's background and found out that he'd been suspended previously. You mentioned substance abuse. Do we know what sort of substances he was using?
To be honest, I don't remember what substances he had used in medical school. Later, it was well established that he was doing a lot of cocaine, that he was drinking, that there were bottles of vodka, and that there was cocaine in his office that was found that his nurses and assistants had flushed down the toilet. But I'm not exactly sure what he went to rehab for when he was in medical school.
He had a relationship with Kellie Martin, who was his surgical assistant for a while. What do we know about her relationship with Dr. Duntsch?
So Kellie Martin is a really fascinating character. She showed up at Duntsch's office to first get a job in Daisy Dukes, having just come back from a spring break vacation at San Pedro Island, which is kind of this party island off the coast of Texas. And quickly started working in his office, and then they started having an affair. Dr. Duntsch was dating Kimberly Morgan at the same time that he was moving his girlfriend, Wendy Young, with their 2 young children to Texas. And Kimberly Morgan and Duntsch, no one knows exactly what happened between them, but it does seem like they partied a lot together. She was very instrumental to his business. And over time, she became disillusioned when she saw the bad outcomes and when she had patients die on the table and realized that this was maybe not coincidence, that these bad outcomes were happening over and over again. She ultimately went ahead and testified against Duntsch at trial.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with Marshall Louis, an executive producer of the Dr. Death podcast. I'm interested in Duntsch's bedside manner and what he was like with patients prior to surgery. Did he seem sure of himself in terms of what he could realistically deliver?
By all accounts, he was very confident. It's something that I think the TV show does a very good job of portraying with Joshua Jackson in the first episode, where he speaks to the couple before the surgery and assures them that he is the best surgeon in Texas for this type of surgery. He would say it with a lot of confidence. And, I never met Christopher Duntsch or sat across from him in the making of the podcast, but Michelle Sugar, the DA, who did sit across from Duntsch as part of the prosecution, said that Josh Jackson was very accurate in the way that he portrayed Duntsch's confidence and even arrogance.
You mentioned his close friend before. I believe his name was Jerry Summers, who he performed surgery on. What exactly went wrong there and what happened afterwards?
Jerry Summers and Christopher Duntsch were friends from childhood. They reconnected while Duntsch was in medical school, and Jerry Summers essentially became his go-to, like his man Friday. He would help him with everything. He moved to Dallas with him. They were the best of friends, and also he helped him set up his office and would give Duntsch rides. And he always had back problems, and he asked Duntsch to perform surgery on him to fix his back. And the result was he woke up screaming in pain, and what had essentially happened was that Duntsch had almost severed his head from his body. He had severed so many ligaments and nerves that his head was barely attached. Unfortunately, Jerry Summers never walked again, and he passed away this past summer.
I'm interested in the aftermath of these surgeries because these are pretty horrific outcomes. And obviously, surgeries don't always go to plan, but what were the patients and their families saying? Because surely there were a lot of questions.
I think, so we did an update episode with Jerry Summers. He was finally ready to talk to us last summer. This was just a few months before he passed away. And we talked to him, and his girlfriend at the time, who knew Duntsch well, thought that it was a normal mistake. It was many years or months, and not until he was arrested and lost his license and everything that people realized that it had really been an error on Duntsch's part. Dr. Duntsch kept telling him that he's going to walk again, that this is temporary. And I think Jerry believed him for a long time. It was really hard for Jerry in those first weeks and months. I mean, he was obviously bedridden and really upset, but he still trusted his friend. And I think it took a while for him to realize that his ability to walk and move was never going to come back.
Were people reporting him? Because as you say, there were things being found like a sponge that had been left there or the wrong vertebrae had been operated on. Were these things being properly reported?
The specifics were not always being reported, but when, in particular, Dr. Robert Henderson and Dr. Randall Kirby, and there were a few other doctors as well, when they really started to understand the gravity of what he was doing and the consistency with which his patients were having bad outcomes, they reported him to the Texas Medical Board, and nothing was done. And because the hospitals would let him resign as opposed to firing him, the hospitals were under no legal obligation to report him. That is how he was able to go from one hospital to the next without them finding out that he had had a bad outcome elsewhere.
Do we know why nothing was done by the Texas Medical Board. Was there no precedent for a surgeon, either intentionally or routinely, causing this kind of pain and suffering on their patients?
That's a good question. The reason it took so long for Duntsch to be charged with a crime is because he actually, in the end, was the first doctor ever in the country that we're aware of to be charged with a criminal act while performing surgery. Because, as you can imagine, it's a very difficult thing to do when doctors are protected by doing what they need to do in performing surgery. To try to prove that there was a criminal intent there is really difficult, which is what Michelle Shugart was managed to prosecute him with a criminal charge, which had not happened before. Before that, there were many opportunities to have his license taken away, but the medical system in America is not really set up to identify bad doctors in that way. In fact, it's often that there's more concern about frivolous lawsuits that are brought against doctors for malpractice than there are about cases like this, where you have a doctor who really should not be practicing. The system is not set up to stop them.
And what eventually led to Dr. Duntsch's medical license being revoked?
So Dr. Henderson and Dr. Kirby first became aware of Duntsch in mid-2012 and tried to report him then and did report him then and did make some outreach. He continued to operate for another year almost and have more bad outcomes. And it wasn't until they were so frustrated that they went to the press that Duntsch's hospital privileges and then his medical license was finally suspended. It was because there was starting to be articles and local news reports about a doctor who had all these bad outcomes, including 2 patients who had died. And that was really what caused his medical license to finally be suspended. And even then, he still had the option of going to other states and practicing medicine, which is why they continued their fight to make sure that he was charged criminally.
When he was eventually arrested, a lawyer had to, as you say, uncover why these things had happened. Did we learn in that trial period about what his motivation was?
Well, he had an email that he had written, and he would write these long, rambling, I think, coked up emails to people. And he had sent one to Kimberly Morgan in which he called himself a cold-blooded killer. He said, I'm ready, something like, I'm ready to leave this world and the space between God and something else. And he called himself somewhere between God, Einstein, and the Antichrist. And he said, I'm ready to become a cold-blooded killer. So that was one of the things that Kimberly Morgan turned over to the prosecutors. And in the trial, that was presented as evidence of intent to the jury. And it still is a question. I mean, there are definitely people who believe that that was, while very self-aggrandizing and arrogant and disturbing, that it's still unclear whether he was really, a murderer in the sense that he used surgery to kill people, or was he just way overconfident and thought that he was a fantastic world-class surgeon who actually didn't know what he was doing, and he had so little self-awareness that he just constantly made terrible choices that ended in people getting injured or dying. So that is kind of the question that nobody has been able to answer definitively.
And was he charged for all those cases?
So he was charged with one particular case, and much like when they caught Al Capone on tax evasion, the trial was centered around the patient, Mary Efert, and the charge was actually elder abuse. In Texas, Michelle Shugart very cleverly figured out that elder abuse is a crime that carries with it a very stiff sentence. You can be put away for decades. And that was what Michelle Shugart wanted. She felt like if these patients are serving a life sentence, she should as well. And you could get a life sentence for elder abuse. So the one charge that he was convicted of was the surgery on Mary Efert because she was older, because she was over 65. And then in the trial, they were allowed to present a limited number of other cases and patients to come and share their story about what had happened to them as circumstantial. But he wasn't actually tried for any of those.
This has been called numerous times a precedent-setting case because this had never been done before in terms of a doctor being found guilty of trying to harm their patients. Do you think this will have long-term implications on other cases going forward?
I don't know case law, and I haven't followed the courts well enough since we made this podcast to know whether, in fact, this has been brought against any other doctors. I can say that I do know that Dr. Kirby mentioned recently that this is now being taught in law schools as a case study. So perhaps people will take this knowledge, and hopefully there's no doctor out there who's doing what Christopher Duntsch was doing, but it certainly will set a precedent.
We, the jury, having found the defendant, Christopher Daniel Duntsch, guilty of injury to an elderly individual as charged in the indictment, unanimously assess his punishment and confinement in the institutional division of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice for life.
As you might imagine, after this was all over, a huge sense of relief for these victims and their relatives. They say even though this case was tried for what happened to Mary Efert, it gives them all a sense of peace and some closure. And they tell me they hope it sends a message to other doctors and the hospitals that let them practice that this can never be allowed to happen again.
Marshall Louis is the Chief Content Officer for Wondery, who has helped create a number of their hit podcasts, including Joe Exotic, Tiger King, and Dr. Death. You can find a link to his work in our show notes. The Dr. Death podcast has now been turned into an 8-part television series starring Joshua Jackson, Christopher Slater, and Alec Baldwin. You can stream it now on Stan. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Sound design is by Ian Camilleri, and our producer is Gia Moylan. If you've been enjoying our recent episodes, let us know. Leave us a review on your favourite podcast app or share us with your friends so more people can hear our stories. And for more from me, you can listen to Mamamia Out Loud 3 times a week. It's Monday, Wednesday and Friday, and it's the podcast with what women are talking about.